when we talk about mental toughness, I very often talk about it introduces two components into culture. There's this idea of resilience that you've mentioned, and also the idea of positivity, the belief that there's actually something better. But I think coaching is also part of that culture. That has to be that part of that culture. We expect the leadership of an organization to build a culture, but actually, it'd be fantastic if everybody dealt with each other as coaches and not just expected to be top down. And that when we get that sort of behavior in practice, maybe we'll create super organizations.
When I find myself in a place where I just completely agree with someone, my mind always starts to, okay, but are there any outliers? Is there something that I shouldn't be agreeing with? So I think it would be an interesting part of a conversation or of a discussion on to see if there are cultures or industries or organizations where a coaching culture would not be helpful. And I can imagine some starting points. Perhaps they would turn out to be wrong, but in general, I absolutely agree with you. I can hardly imagine a coaching approach in an army, for example. Where should I put this piece of nuclear waste? I think that's not kind of it's not really a situation where you need coaching. That's where you need clear direction. Of course, I just meant this as a joke. But I think there are some situations where coaching or situations or practices where coaching is very relevant and is needed. And I really think that there are some situations where coaching could be a bit of a time-consuming thing.
You say that, and you use the military as an example, but was it Marshal Ney, who was Napoleon's marshal? He said, you need a plan to go into battle, but the minute the battle starts, the plan goes out the window. And what he meant was that you trusted the troops. They were in the battle. You didn't know where they were. And I suppose that's about team working. And if team coaching has a role, that's where it would matter, It may have a huge impact there.
In that sense, I absolutely agree again.
Yeah. An interesting question. You spoke earlier, and you mentioned it a couple of times, about your own personal journey. What would be the one, maybe there's more than one thing that you think you have learned over your career, perhaps from the moment you left university? What is the one big thing that you have learned?
Never stop learning. but that's not really a big saying. But on one hand, that's very important for me. Yeah. And I had a colleague who wrote an article about hubris. I hope I'm pronouncing this properly.
You are perfect.
So one of our conversations really stuck with me, and we were just exploring the notion of hubris, and he just said that the moment when you see that you are not developing any further, when everything just goes by the plan and everything is perfect, on one hand you should be celebrating, and on the other hand, it is a nice thing if you just start questioning whether you are really in the right place or have you mistaken something. So I really believe in continuous development and that we shouldn't stop doing it. And we can always be ready but we are never perfect. We are never complete. That's an important learning for me.
Because I've been thinking a lot about it recently. When I was young, I think I was very judgmental. Everything I saw the world as black and white. There were people I liked and people I didn't like. And there were things that I liked to see and things I didn't like to see, even down to the music. Now, 50 years on, I'm doing it naturally, but I'm also working hard at it to remove judgment. And I find it incredibly liberating. So, things like, it's a trivial thing, but I wasn't a big fan of punk. But I now listen to it and I think, I get it, And I find I think the reason why I'm raising being non-judgmental in this context is I think if I was to be a coach, that's what I would try to be avoid making judgments. And I think it must be one hell of a tricky thing for a coach to do to avoid being judgmental?
It's definitely not easy. And I can relate to that, not specifically to being judgmental, but to using my interpretation or my intuition. That was an important learning from me. I'm, as we have mentioned, I'm kind of a theory man. That's where my evidence-based approach and enthusiasm is coming from. So I find it pretty easy to have a quick interpretation of what is going on for my clients. They tell me their stories, and I'm pretty quick to come up with a psychological or whatever theoretical interpretation that now you are experiencing this and that or whatever. And one of my big learnings was to put a leash on my interpretations. Just give the pieces of the puzzle to my clients. I just offer them some concepts. How would your story relate to, for example, the 4 C's of mental toughness, if they have an understanding of that? Or how would they relate to whatever? And how would you make up the puzzle? Because sometimes, even in a non-judgmental way, I was fixing their puzzle. Yeah. I was giving them an interpretation of their stories. And sometimes I still believe I do believe that that's my ego. I do believe that I see the proper interpretation, but it is not helpful for them. It's much better for them, and that's my real learning, to come up with their own interpretations, even if it is not the perfect one, or even if it doesn't fit my and who I am to decide whether their interpretation or mine is perfect. I cannot know, but they need to come up with something that is workable for them. And even their interpretations, their understanding shouldn't be perfect. It just be good enough to ignite change in their situations. And even if their interpretation is a complete failure, if it doesn't make sense from a psychological or whatever sense, if it helps them to change in the given direction, then I can be happy with that. So how to use my interpretation, how to balance out theory and intuition, I think that was an interesting learning from me.
Yeah.
And following up on that, if you allow me one more thing,
please.
Pandora's box about my learnings, then it was an important point in my journey, how to get rid of my thoughts.
Yeah.
Because as I'm coming from these theoretical approaches, and it's pretty easy for me to work within theoretical frameworks, it was very hard for me to get away from working with just thoughts or with thoughts at all, and just to be there with emotions, or work with the bodies of people, with movements, with physical senses. And sometimes these are as important as the thoughts behind those.
For the listener, this could be quite boring. We agree all the time.
We are pretty similar in our approaches, so
yeah.
Because I work in an area more controversial, and you can judge me.
I work in an area where it's very easy for people to become very judgmental. When we talk about the mental toughness concept, unfortunately, quite a few people look at it and think, oh, everybody should be more mentally tough because it gives an advantage. But when you dig below the surface of the concept, you simply are who you are. And the trick is to become the best version of you that you can be, and not necessarily to change anybody. And that's quite a hard thing to grasp, for a lot of people. And it was actually a mutual colleague that got me thinking about this. Now, yes, well, you've interviewed him in your podcast series. That was Jonathan Passmore. He actually spoke at a conference, and it was a coaching conference, and he was on just before me. And he stood there and he said, how many people in this audience think that coaching is non-directive? And everybody put their hand up in the air. And he said, that's nonsense. The minute you ask even the most open question, you are directing. And he went on to explain it. And I thought, he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. And yet we had a room full of coaches, and some very talented coaches, who thought they weren't being directed. So that's quite a tough ask, in this idea of being non-judgmental, not bringing your own biases into the picture.
Yes, even your questions are coming from somewhere, but
yeah.
But at the end of the day, or end of my thinking, or clients are coming to us for help, and even by opening new fields of thinking, we can give them help, and or directive, also the directions we are giving, they materialize or they take shape in the forms of the new fields we are opening. I think where we have to practice being non-judgmental is to accept if our clients don't want to play on those fields, and they would need new fields to be opened, new thoughts, new provocations. How I see the directivity of coaching is that I have two pictures in my mind. One of them is a highway, which is pretty directive because you can just go one way in it, or it's pretty restricted how you can drive in a highway. And the other is a field where you can just wander around. And I like to consider myself or my coaching as a practice that opens up new playgrounds or new playing fields where my clients can wander in whatever direction they want to, or even leave it, as opposed to being on a highway where I'm just guiding them towards a single given goal or a single given concept.
So are you touching there about, when we talk about coaching, and there's a lot of coaches who see themselves as purists and they kind of look down the nose at mentoring and say, oh, coach is not mentoring. But coaching overlaps with mentoring, doesn't it?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I think it would depend on the professional whom you ask, what are the overlaps, and on the books you are reading about it. But for me, both of them use a very similar skill set. In mentoring, it is much more okay to bring in your experiences as learning points, and they can be starting points for a further conversation. When a seasoned mentor or an experienced manager shares a learning that they had, that could be a starting point for the mentee to reflect on it, how they would use it. Would they use it at all? And in coaching, I think we don't really recommend that practice. We don't really recommend the coach to bring in their own experiences with a certain topic, with a certain challenge, whatever, and then move on with that, because that would be considered as giving advice, even if it is not done with that intention. And in mentoring, there is a much bigger space for giving advice or just for sharing experience. And for me, mentoring does involve a lot of activities that are not taking place, or could involve activities that are not taking place inside the mentoring conversation. For example, like making introductions, or if the mentoring takes place within an organizational context, then you can pull some strings for your mentee. I think that could fit into the concept of mentoring, but that's my interpretation, and every mentor and every company has a different approach to mentoring. And this is a place where we could just circle back to your thought about boundaries around coaching and boundaries around mentoring, that these are pretty flexible things these days, or that's my impression, that depending on the number of depending on the coaches you ask, they will each have a slightly different definition of what coaching is or what mentoring is. Hopefully there will be some shared concepts at the core of these.
I would like to think so, because in our definition, or our explanation, should I say, of learning orientation and the mental toughness concept, we talk about reflection on your experiences and the experiences of others around you. Learning is going to come from both, isn't it? So
absolutely. And I love that part of the concept, because for me, learning orientation is the key for self-reflection. Or that's where self-reflection comes to the model. And as you have mentioned previously, that it is not just the mentally tough who could be successful, but those who have self-reflection on their own mental toughness. So those with a higher learning orientation, I think those are the ones who are deemed to be successful. And whenever I'm engaging with my coaches, even in the first conversations, I think learning orientation is the concept that I'm looking for. That's what I want to see in my coaches. Are they there? Are they open to learn? Are they open to explore? And if this is lacking, then that's where I start to have concerns about our processes.
And that, I think, is a good point at which to stop, Zolly. That's been a brilliant conversation. I think anybody listening is going to be as impressed as I've always been whenever having a conversation with you. You have a very clear, but sort of a widely accepting picture of coaching and mentoring. So it's not black and white, but it's very, very clear. That's what I like about it.
Thank you. You know, my challenge with me speaking in such occasions is that I think I don't think highly enough of myself, or that's what my friends are saying. I think that, well, others are thinking about similar things or similar ways, and then they just come back to me and they say, no, you are not, or they are not. And I'm like, okay. I think this is just the normal thing. That this is where my judgment is coming in.
Now,
should be thinking like me, but no.
Everybody
I know. Thank you
for
your compliments.
Everyone I know, Zolly, sees you as thoughtful, but it's one thing to be thoughtful and have these ideas churning around inside your head. It's another to be able to articulate them as clearly as you do. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have been able to talk with you. I enjoyed it as well, and of course, I'm grateful for you to have invited me for this cool
my pleasure.
of conversations.